Hi everyone. As you can probably tell, this video is a little bit different than what I normally post. You can probably tell by the intro and just how everything looks here. Granted, it is a talking head video. It's not something I normally would talk about. As a matter of fact, if I wasn't involved or had been part of what happened, I probably wouldn't be talking about it at all. Granted, it is a major news incident, but that's not something I normally cover. But before I go any further, I do want to state a couple things. Firstly, this is mainly personal experience, what I'm talking about. I was there. I experienced quite a bit of this. Any other information that I talk about is going to be information that I gathered myself through news outlets or watching interviews from officials. But this is all my opinion. This is not fact. This is not 100% certainty. This is my opinion on what I went through and my experiences on what I went through. Now that we got that out of the way, the news is a very rapid and fluid kind of thing. Things happen all the time. Well, about a week ago, in my hometown of Garden Grove, we had a small incident occur at the GKN Aerospace Transparencies Division on the intersection of Chapman and Western Avenue. Now, I'm not a stranger to this facility. I have seen it before, and they've had hazmat events occur before. So I wasn't terribly shocked when I found out that while I was at work, a small evacuation area had been placed on Thursday due to one of these chemical tanks that they have on site, apparently popping its check valve and having some sort of issue with temperature. When that occurred, OCFA came out and they handled the situation as best as they could and as well as anyone can figure they did. The evacuation area was lifted and things went back to normal, or so we thought. Unfortunately, the next day, Friday at 6 a.m., another evacuation area had been issued. This time, my residence was involved. At 6 in the morning, I had a singular police vehicle roll through my neighborhood, make a quick announcement telling everyone that they must evac immediately. This is a mandatory evacuation, without telling us anything else, saying we need to leave the area. They did leave, and they went to the other side of our street. There's a larger residential area on the other side. We're next to a school, so a lot of our property is mostly the school. And they continued to make their announcements. It was 6 in the morning, and personally, I was actually really confused because at first when I heard the police officer, he hit his air horn, I thought he was pulling over a kid on an e-bike or something like that. That wasn't the case. Apparently, what had happened at the GKN Aerospace building was a lot more severe than originally was let on. Unfortunately, we didn't know how severe at the time. Like I said, the officer told me, it's time to leave, mandatory evacuation, grab what you deem essential for a day, and go ahead and leave. And that's exactly what we did. We took our dogs. We took as much supplies as we could for our dogs at the time because we were actually ready to go get them more food, so they didn't have a lot of food here. We grabbed some clothing, some bedding, nothing major, and I grabbed one of my laptops, the 17-inch little low-end laptop. I really didn't think anything of it because I was being told this is mainly for precautionary measures and you just need to leave because there's a possibility of things can go wrong. And that's exactly what the Mayor Pro Tem and a couple other places stated. You know, the Mayor Pro Tem was posting on Facebook saying, hey, this is just a cautionary evac. We do need you to leave. Well, that did change in a couple hours. Very quickly, the posts from our officials became a little bit more serious, urging people, if they haven't yet, to evac. To a third post where it opened with, this is not looking very good. If you're in the evacuation zone, I strongly urge you to leave. We were really confused because we really hadn't seen much more of what was going on outside of knowing that the GKN Aerospace building had had some sort of issue earlier on Thursday. They did not immediately tell us that was the problem. They were just telling us to evac because it was precautionary. In my head, I assumed that that was probably why we were evacing again. Something had been found, or there was a bigger issue that we were unaware of with this tank before, they were making the announcement. Now, of course, we did decide to evac, and as we were packing up, a couple of odd things occurred. Namely, we had a school teacher who attempted to enter the school across the street. The school had been locked up by the custodian because the police officer told the custodian, hey man, just lock up the school, take off, you don't want to be here. And that's what the custodian did. And I do not fault him. This teacher drove up and asked me and some of my family members, hey, why is the school locked up? Where's the custodian? And I told her, I was like, I described him. I go, is this him? She goes, yeah. I go, he was told by the police to leave and evacuate and lock up the school. And she was really confused. She goes, well, I haven't heard anything from my superintendent. And that's because they had never told the school district about this yet. Essentially, teachers were still driving to several schools in this evacuation area, not knowing that the schools had been closed, locked up, and secured, and they were not going to be going there. So this teacher, after she was informed of what was going on, managed to get a hold of her superintendent. And I guess there was a lot of communication suddenly bursting back and forth between multiple teachers, because multiple teachers were arriving at the school only to find out that they were not able to get inside. And with that happening, they were reaching out to the superintendent. The superintendent told everyone, yeah, we're going to go ahead and just leave the schools. We are going to be evacuating, but be on standby. If it goes like yesterday, we should be able to open the schools probably around noon, and then you can go back in and we can take care of stuff. The school buses were also not aware of this situation. The school buses were still en route, and the bus yard was actually being evacuated because the evacuation zone covered that area. The yard master, from what I was told, actually got on the radio and told the school bus drivers, hey, stop where you are. I don't want you going any further, picking up any more kids. If you have any kids on your school bus, stay where you are. We're going to be sending the parents to pick them up. Apparently, the school bus that was on the way to the school near my house actually managed to make it to the driveway, again, also finding it locked. That school bus had to stay at that point and go ahead and have the parents come into the evacuation zone to go ahead and pick up their kids. At this point, most of us had been leaving. The few people that were staying behind were being knocked on by the police, telling them, hey, it's time to leave. This is a mandatory evacuation. I did leave, and we took off, and that was kind of the last information that we had officially. Again, I had a nagging feeling that it was part of this GKN Aerospace building that had a tank issue earlier in the previous day, maybe acting up again. While we drove around and tried to figure out where we should go, because at the time there were no evacuation centers open, we pulled into one of our local shopping centers and just kind of collaborated. They did open up 2 evacuation shelters, one in the Garden Grove area and one in the Stanton area. The one in the Stanton area was actually very close to the Aerospace building. I believe it was City Hall. Finally, we did end up going to my friend's house and kind of hanging out over there for the day, because at the time we didn't know where the evacuation shelters were at. And by the time we did pull up to his house and got notifications of where they were, we noticed they were kind of far away from us. So we decided to just hang out at my friend's place for the time being. It wasn't until then, when we decided to go to his house and we turned on the news, did we find out what was going on. I was correct in assuming that that particular tank was actually involved in this situation again. It seems that at this time, the cooling efforts that they had done was not enough, and the tank was now in a sort of crisis mode. They weren't telling us how severe this crisis was, just that it was a crisis situation, and we needed to stay away, and we needed to evacuate. So, from this point on, I had left. And I kind of want to stop my narration here, and I'm actually going to bring up a sort of timeline of what occurs from here on out. Essentially, so Thursday, we have already talked about, that was when the check valve popped due to the overpressure, and they had the emergency cooling system activate, and they did the evac. So we are on to Friday now. Everyone finds out that the tank is still unstable, and the temperature is still high enough to have the emergency cooling system be active. Not to mention, the Orange County Fire Authority also had placed a unmanned hose that would be spraying water directly onto the tank. That way nobody would be nearby in case anything were to happen. So further on down the line, they also reveal to us that the valve, there is a drain valve, that unfortunately is inoperable. They could not open it to drain the chemical out of the tank. At the same time, apparently there were some pumps. These pumps were inaccessible due to the fact that the control panels were being hit by large amounts of water from the emergency cooling system, rendering those panels inoperable as well. So we now had a tank that was going under some sort of reaction and overheating with no methods of getting the chemical out. This particular chemical is called methyl methacrylate, or MMA for short. This is used in the creation of acrylics and other sort of plastic, strong, durable plastics like plexiglass. And apparently what was occurring was some sort of heating event inside of the tank. Upon finding out that their drain valves and the pumps were inoperable, the teams, government, OCFA, had all reached out to the tank manufacturer asking them, hey, we have a situation and we can't safely remove the chemical. What are our options? And on Friday, this tank manufacturer responded and said, so there's only really two outcomes for this situation that we're aware of. You're either going to have a tank rupture and you're going to have a mix of plexiglass, MMA, and in liquid and vapor form escape the tank and create some sort of hazardous response. Or you may have a situation where you have something called a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, or BLEVE, occur. Essentially what would happen is the tank becomes so hot that the chemical boils into a vapor, and the vapor will rupture the tank. And when it ruptures, due to the very high volatility of this MMA chemical when it is hot, generally results in explosion. So those were the two options that the tank manufacturer gave us. Or not us, but the city of Garden Grove and OCFA. So we were, as the residents, slightly alarmed at this notion. Now, I did do some very basic rudimentary calculations, and I was full on assuming there was 68,000 gallons of MMA because the tank in question was a 34,000 gallon tank, and there was a sibling tank next to it that was also 34,000 gallons. With a 68,000 gallon payload, you were looking at something that would have leveled quite a bit within a mile plus radius. And I was visibly concerned at this because that would mean that where I live no longer exists, along with everything inside of it. We're out, our dogs are out, but I mean, I didn't even grab work clothes at this point because I was told, hey, this isn't a really big deal, this is just a precautionary evacuation. Once this information was released, the evac area was expanded. It had moved from just Garden Grove and Stanton all the way into Anaheim, Westminster, and even parts of Winter Park. The evacuation zone became very, very large, and they even had to shut down freeway on and off ramps because they did not want people being able to inadvertently access the evacuation zones. Now, a couple other things happened on Friday when it came to this. The two shelters that they had in place, unfortunately, were only going to be daytime shelters, which meant they were going to operate from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. We did try to make it over to one to see what the capacity looked like, but we were actually basically turned away due to traffic just coming to a standstill and the police telling us, hey, you need to leave, there's no more room. And I was a little disappointed, but upon leaving, we were informed via Facebook that these two shelters that they had in place were actually closing at 8 p.m. We had gotten there at around 7. And we would have been there for a whole hour before being told, hey, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to keep you here overnight. You're going to have to leave. So we went back to my friend's place after stopping and picking up some more supplies and things at the local Walmart. Later in the night, they did finally manage to get some overnight shelters opened up. But due to the fact that there were so many people evacuated at this point, the shelters filled up with a matter of hours for the most part, until you started getting to ones that were fairly far away. We had some in Huntington Beach, we had some in Fountain Valley, Miles Square Park. These were all places that took longer than others to fill up. But by the time we would have been ready to get over there, the shelters would have been full. So we decided to stay in place in Anaheim at my friend's location until further notice. When we got back, we noticed that the evacuation zone had actually expanded one major cross street away from where my friend lived. So this posed a new possible threat of evacuation again. We had to be ready to evacuate from the location we evacuated to in case this situation got any worse. Friday was definitely a very hectic, and I want to say probably the poorest managed of the days when it comes to how everything occurred. They were a reactionary response to everything, and with that being in place, we saw residents basically moving from spot to spot because they weren't able to stay at the original evacuation zones. Especially the one like at Stanton, they had to relocate to Cypress. The one in Garden Grove / Westminster area, you're able to stay there, but only until 8 p.m. Places like the Elks Lodge, Mile Square Park, Red Cross, a lot of people stepped in to try and help out, which is great. But the lack of transparency and the lack of communication on Friday was a big issue in my opinion, because it left some of us, the first people who were told to evac from the original evacuation zone, at a disadvantage. We only took what we thought would be necessary for about a day. At this point, when the other cities were being evacuated because the zone was expanding into them, they were telling their residents, be prepared to be gone from 24 to 72 hours. So it kind of felt like a poor communication process from Garden Grove to let its residents know what was going on. I mean, just the communication between the school district and the government seemed to be a little rocky at best. Meanwhile, they still continue to spray water on it and keep the emergency cooling system activated in order to hopefully bring the temperature of the tank down. Overnight, they use things like drones and other imaging technologies to try and get an idea of what the tank is doing temperature-wise. And originally, they thought it was actually starting to cool down because they were seeing some lower temperatures. It turns out, I guess, the drone was actually imaging the wrong portions of the tank, and they were actually not getting an accurate reading of what the tank was actually temperatured at. So when it came to Saturday, the crews had to make an announcement telling us that the tank actually has not stabilized at all overnight. The temperatures have climbed even higher, and at this time on Saturday morning, they were sitting at 90 degrees. Now, the sketchy part about this is when it comes to MMA, the thermal runaway point is somewhere in the 110 to 120 degree point from what I've read. So we were sitting at 90. This was not good. And from what the teams had gathered, the tanks were, the tank, because it was only one tank that was really in crisis, was raising temperature-wise 1 degree per hour. So in another 10 hours, we'd be at 100. In another 20 hours or a day, we'd be at 110. And they continued to tell everyone, hey, do not enter the evac zone. It is, you are not allowed. The police departments will deny you. And at this point, we had about, I want to say 5 or 6 police departments. We had Garden Grove. We had Stanton, which is Orange County Sheriff's. We had Cypress. We had Anaheim. We had Fountain Valley. And we had Buena Park. All in the areas, along with, I believe, even the city of La Palma. So up to about 7 different police departments in the area of Garden Grove, Stanton, Anaheim, and Buena Park, and Westminster, trying to keep the evacuation zones closed. Like I said earlier, it was fairly unfortunate, though, for us few people that started the evacs originally, not knowing how long we would be gone for, that we weren't able to go back in. Some of us did make attempts, and there were actually quite a few successful runs back in. I personally managed to go get more clothes, work clothes, and more things for the dogs, and things like that. And upon my cruising through the evac zones, I actually found in my neighborhood several houses that just refused to evacuate. They were staying in their houses. They had apparently enough food. The electricity and water and gas were not turned off, so they were able to just continue living in their residences outside of the fact they were essentially the only ones there. And there's probably a couple reasons why some of these houses did that. Looting, burglary, those are all very rampant in situations like this, especially when the evac zone becomes so big that the police aren't going to be able to block every sort of way in. And that was the case here. The city of Cyprus started to reduce some of its resources, and it was much more viable to enter the evacuation zone into even the original evacuation zone through the Cyprus side when it came to the residents of West Garden Grove and Cypress. Stanton is a different story. Orange County sheriffs had that area locked down pretty tight due to the fact that it was relatively close to the GKN Aerospace building. I did manage to get some footage of some of the evac area once it had been evac'd. The interesting thing, though, is while yes, traffic was basically restricted, people were still leaving, even on Saturday. So there was still some traffic exiting, and strangely enough, a lot of transients and people like that were still just hanging out at bus stops, sleeping, unbothered from the police department and everything like that, I guess, normally that they'd be hassled by. And we're not very concerned about if anything were to happen. I saw quite a few that were just hanging out on bus stops and things like that, or just kind of cruising the neighborhoods, which also could be some of the people who were doing other not so legal things. And I'm sure I'll have some of this footage up while I'm talking about this as well. Saturday was definitely we were starting to enter that sort of danger zone when it came to the possibilities of the tank hitting BLEVE. And Sunday was no different. So as we entered Sunday, we now had a reading on the tanks at 100 degrees, but the caveat was the tank's gauge only went to 100. So there was a distinct possibility that the temperature was reading higher than 100. At this point, it was sort of an all hands on deck, everyone get out. This is our sort of do or die moment. The tank's either going to rupture or it's going to BLEVE. It did not look good. And again, they were stressing that if anyone was still in the evac zone, it is definitely time to leave. You may not have heeded our warnings before, but like, this is dire. The tank may explode. About midway through that day on Sunday, though, apparently one of the overnight crews finally got their data back, and they had discovered at the top of this particular tank at the GKN Aerospace building, there was a crack that had formed. And it was kind of a double-edged sword, because now they were worried that there may be a chemical release of some sort. The air monitors hadn't picked anything up yet, but they were talking about the possibility of that happening. But the other side, the pressure was starting to lower. Their readings on the pressure inside of the tank seemed to be dropping, and got to the point where there was no massive overpressure situation. So on Sunday, we finally managed to get past the threat of a BLEVE. At this point, that small crack, which either was incurred by the overpressure situation, or maybe it was already there, who knows, that crack caused the pressure in the tank to stabilize, causing the threat of a BLEVE to be eliminated. So, while Sunday started grim, with the threat of a BLEVE essentially being eliminated or removed from the situation, Sunday started to look a little bit more optimistic. There was still obviously a risk of an explosion of some type or a fire. It would be localized, but there was a sibling tank that still had MMA in it, and they were unsure of the situation with that tank, so there was still a very large risk of some sort of massive explosion, or there would have been a spill. So they still weren't out of the woods yet, but things were starting to look at least more positive for the tank that was in crisis. Well, they did finally get to look at that sibling tank later on in Sunday, and they apparently found out it only had about 11,000 gallons inside of it instead of 34. So together, I think it was about 20,000 gallons, give or take, that may have been in between both of the tanks. And they also managed to put a neutralizing agent into that sibling tank, which made the chemical MMA inert. So that was also a big win. Sunday originally kind of started off sketchy, but got better. At this point, I believe two things happened also as well. The governor of California had declared a state of emergency for what was going on, and also requested federal aid as well on Sunday. We hadn't heard anything back even towards the end of Sunday, but I know those were two things that occurred. We go into Sunday night and into Monday. The evacuation zones still hold. There's nothing different. It is still a rather large evac area. We are still unsure what's going on with that tank because the fire department had admitted they were unable to really get close enough to the tank to see what was going on. Again, the city and OCFA had admitted this was a sort of first of its kind event for them. So they were reaching out to experts all across the country and apparently at one point all across the world, seeing if they could come up with something. Once Monday rolled around, though, federal aid was activated and the tanks were still being doused with water both from the emergency cooling system and the unmanned hoses. This time, they noticed the temperature gauge had dropped from the 100 red line down to 93, so we were starting to see a reduction in temperature. Usually that means that the chemical polymerization process, apparently, which generates heat, may be slowing down or finishing up, which means there's going to be more plexiglass than there is MMA inside of the tank. That was a bit of an optimistic sign. And as the day went on, they continued to monitor it and realized that the tank definitely would not hit BLEVE on Monday, and they decided that it was safe to, at around, I want to say 7:30 p.m. or so, reduce the evac zone down to a very, very small area. We finally were able to leave and go back on Monday night. I got back around 10 p.m. and the evac zone now was only a few thoroughfare streets. Obviously, the street western was still barricaded, but even not, which is the next major street in front of it, was barricaded, and Beach was as well. It was kind of a weird square that they had made, and they still kept the barricades out in front of there. Monday night, a lot of people did get back, and we rolled into Tuesday. Unfortunately, I want to say about 65% of the residents were able to go home on Monday, so there was still 35% that were unable to, and they were mainly in the city of Stanton. Stanton was still kind of really in the red zone at this point because it lies on the border of Garden Grove and Stanton, and those people were still waiting to find out if they could go home. Well, Tuesday rolls around, and the tanks continue to decrease in temperature. The crisis tank now was at a 92 degree temperature, even with the emergency water system and unmanned hoses turned off. So at this time, water was not needed on the tank to keep it at that temperature. That was just ambient temperature, period. So things were looking more positive at this point. At that point, they decided to reduce the evacuation zone even further on the evening of Tuesday, down to like essentially like a 300-foot radius around the GKN Aerospace building. And basically all residents were finally able to go home, which is great. It's Wednesday now as I'm making this, and there's still information that's coming along. So at this point, it looks like Incident Command or the command post is going to be stepping down. They are going to be closing up the situation here. They have been slowly processing as much of the chemical as they can out. The neutralized tank is not a threat, and they are still worried of maybe a very small isolated fire or isolated leak, but if that does occur, it's going to stay on the property. It's not going to be like what we saw with the BLEVE. The other things that are occurring is, and I didn't mention this earlier, but the map or the area right behind GKN is an RV and boat storage facility. Those people are finally going to be able to go back and take a look at their equipment and see if it's okay or what needs to be done with that. Most major streets have been reopened as well. The only one that I think they're keeping closed right now is Western, and that may change later on. This has really kind of been like a week-long event that started on Thursday and is sort of wrapping up on Wednesday. And I mean, we're still not fully done with it, and I know the news is very fluid, and I know there are other accidents that have occurred. Unfortunately, there was a paper mill or a paper manufacturing plant in Washington that suffered a massive tank implosion with a tank full of white liquor, which is very dangerous stuff, very corrosive and very bad. And unfortunately, they did have lives lost in that particular event, and that is something that is going on currently. They are doing search and rescue. They're doing everything they possibly can. It is a very, very dire situation over there. Unfortunately, that tank gave way and had spilled its contents out, and that's that's a very devastating thing. For us, we're sort of wrapping up, but I do want to kind of touch on GKN too, because people are now realizing that GKN aren't quite there's other things that have happened at GKN essentially. I have a few events that have occurred from about 2018 onwards, and I will put them up here. During April of 2018, OSHA had cited the facility for poorly maintained machinery and a deficient injury and illness prevention program, which was about a $3,000 civil penalty when it came to fines. In November of 2020, South Coast Air Quality Management District had an audit, and it covered quite a lot of things. There was machinery that was being operated without permits or licenses. There were unauthorized modifications to the equipment that they had on site, and they had not tracked volatile organic compound emissions data for over 5 years. So there was a possibility that stuff had been released into the atmosphere. There was a lot of things that they sort of uncovered in this audit in 2020. The fines for that were close to $1 million. In 2022, there were two sort of small incidents that occurred. Federal OSHA investigators issued a $420 fine after finding the facility failed to provide workers with required respiratory protection equipment during the pandemic. Also, and this one's a little bit more concerning than the other one. Federal OSHA also issued it was a non-monetary citation. So I don't know how this was handled, but they issued a citation after they inspected. They revealed that management was blocking employee access to the mandatory workplace injury logs and safety plans, which meant as an employee, you were not able to gain access to these things, which are sort of important for maintaining records and everything like that. So, no money fine, I guess. I'm not quite sure what that means, but that's a little concerning as a company to prevent your employees from being able to access both the workplace injury logs and safety plans for the facility. That seems a little strange. And then in March 2025, the Air Management, they issued 2 formal notices to comply, ordering GKN to correct missing facility operating records, unregistered equipment, and outdated ownership paperwork. So this company had, for quite some time, seemed to not be keeping proper records and things like that when it came to their machinery, ownership, a bunch of stuff. It just doesn't look good. There is another incident that I can speak of. When it comes to this company, there was a fire that had occurred in the RV storage facility. And that RV storage facility had RVs with propane tanks. Those propane tanks started exploding. GKN apparently gave the general evacuation orders to get out of the facility. But I had never seen a more disorganized sort of scene in my life. I was driving down Western when this was occurring. You saw the plume from the propane tank explosions. There were only 2 of them, and they were a ways off. And when you got to the GKN Aerospace building and the parking lot, you saw employees that were still in full scrub gear. So they had their respirators on, they had their their, I would call them hazmat suits on, things like that. And they were sprinting to their personal vehicles and speeding out of the parking lot. I don't know how they were keeping track or keeping record of who was who or who was still there on the facility or what, but the thing that stuck with me the most from this particular fire wasn't the fact that a couple transients had set the fire and it caught some RVs on fire or anything like that. It was the scene that I saw in the GKN parking lot, where employees were scrambling, sprinting to their vehicles, and then some of them accelerating so quickly they were burning rubber out of the employee parking lot for a mere 2 propane tank explosions. So I can't imagine what the situation looked like when or if anyone even noticed that the tank had hit overheat status and the emergency cooling systems had activated. If that's what I saw for two minor propane tank explosions, who knows what it looked like when they were leaving there. GKN, I think they've issued maybe one statement currently, and it's just kind of like a, we're sorry this happened. More people like myself are finding out about these other violations. I know somebody had made their voices heard at one of the meetings or releases, one of the conferences that the city of Garden Grove was having, where essentially they were saying, the city should have had this situation, could have been preventable, essentially, because there were a lot of warning signs that something probably wasn't going well in the facility. As a matter of fact, a former GKN Aerospace employee has sort of parroted or mirrored that statement where they said there's no way that this particular tank could have fallen into such a state of disrepair without being noticed by inspections and things like that. I don't know how true that is, obviously. This is starting to become like the hearsay portion of it. I haven't personally experienced it. This is information that I am recovering on my own from news outlets and things like that. But to have an employee who had worked for the company for 18 years say that, I mean, it does carry some weight. So I do think there's going to be a lot of questions when it comes to what has occurred here in Garden Grove and this particular situation in general. The mayor of the city also has, coming up in June, a State of the City, which is very much like the State of the Union for the president. And I'm sure that, unfortunately, this State of the City is going to be dominated by questions regarding the GKN Aerospace incident. This also occurred during Memorial Day weekend, which is during the time of Garden Grove's Strawberry Festival, which usually is a happy time, and it was noted that there was a definite lack of attendance at the Strawberry Festival. One could only surmise when half of the city is blocked from accessing the other half of the city, you're gonna have things like that. And, to the residents who essentially just didn't have the transparency or communications that, some of the other residents at other cities had, I can understand their frustrations and why some of them, A, refused to leave or decided to go back into the evacuation zone after being told to leave. Because, I mean, how else are you going to, like, people were staying at hotels, sure, that was another option that was given. But during Memorial Day weekend, a lot of these hotels in Anaheim were charging close to $175 a night during the Memorial Day weekend, and they were giving evacuees sometimes a massive savings of 10% off per night. So the hotel options were they didn't seem like a very good option. And when you have up to 7 different evacuation shelters hitting capacity, it just kind of tells you how many people had been displaced from this particular situation. And I mean, in my opinion, I think the city of Garden Grove, Orange County Fire, I think they did a good job doing the best they could mitigating the situation. What I feel like the city of Garden Grove sort of dropped the ball on the hardest was lack of communication, lack of transparency, and lack of planning when it came to this sort of situation. I feel like if they knew that the tank was doing what it was doing, they sort of sugarcoated the original evacuation by going, oh, this isn't a big deal. Like, it's only going to be for probably the day. It'll be like yesterday on Thursday. And then 3 hours later, walking that back and saying, hey, bad news, this thing might blow up. You might lose your house. You can't go back to get anything else, even though we told you to only take stuff for about a day. We're not going to let you back in. And if you need to stay anywhere, we have our evacuation shelters, which may be full, or you can, pay a very large amount of money to stay at a hotel during Memorial Day weekend. I think that's my biggest problem with this whole situation was the lack of transparency and lack of communication between the city and its residents, especially in the city of Garden Grove. Other cities like Anaheim and Cypress and Buena Park, I felt like they did a better job and informed their residents appropriately for what to expect. Where Garden Grove I don't feel like I got that from them. And that can be frustrating. That can be incredibly frustrating, because I know, unfortunately, some people, did leave their pets, and if things would have turned out much worse, that would have been horrible. And when it came to pet storage, the emergency evacuation shelters were separating the evacuees from their pets for the most part. You could leave them at places like WAGs or some of the emergency shelters that were offering space, but those, of course, also filled up very quickly. We decided to keep our girls with us. I mean, they're Velcro puppies anyway, so Toby would have started screaming if she would have been separated from us. So that kind of also puts our options into perspective as well. We wouldn't have been able to just go up to the first overnight shelter we saw and said, hey, we need to stay here, but also our dogs are going to be staying with us, because they would have been like, no, you can go find somewhere else. The Elks Lodge was probably one of the only exceptions, and major props to the Elks Lodge. They were telling the residents that if they had a leash and a harness, or a crate or a kennel, essentially, that the pets were allowed to stay with you and sleep with you overnight. So I want to say, like, the Elks Lodge in Garden Grove probably was the most accommodating of all of the shelters, and they did that voluntarily, and it is very awesome for the Elks Lodge to do that. I mean, that's my biggest, I think that is my actual biggest complaint about this whole situation, is how the city of Garden Grove initially handled this versus how the other cities handled it, and the way they communicated these sort of situations to their residents compared to the other cities. That was my Memorial Day weekend. I did miss one day of work. I did manage to go to work afterwards once I had managed to get my clothes from my residence in the evac zone, because again, they told me I was only going to be gone for a day, but that was not the case. So obviously this was an emergency situation, and I can appreciate and understand that being an emergency situation, things are going to be very fluid, things are going to change, but I just don't think the way it was initially handled with the previous data from an entire day beforehand was done very well. But that's just my opinion. Um, but yeah, I did want to sort of make something kind of going over what had been going on and why I haven't posted a single thing anywhere on my gaming channel or my vlogs channel or my VODs channel for Twitch, which, by the way, there will not be a Twitch stream this week. I am in the process of recovering and kind of getting everything settled back in, so that's not going to happen. But I did kind of just want to put my thoughts out there when it came to what happened in my hometown and my personal experiences and my personal opinions. And I will again end this video saying what I said in the beginning, that everything that I talked about in this video was personal experience or personal opinion and information that I had found myself through either watching or listening to news outlets or doing research myself on these said companies. These are not factual statements or anything like that. These are all personal experience and personal opinions. So that being said, I could be wrong about some of this stuff, but from a sort of boots on the ground perspective, this is how I felt about the whole situation. What's going to happen to GKN? We don't know. A lot of citizens apparently were not, very unaware of what GKN Aerospace Transparencies did and what kind of chemicals were housed in that facility. Many, many more of them were actually even more unaware that GKN had been fined and cited in previous occurrences. There are some very vocal members of the community who want GKN to leave. GKN is, I'm sure, weighing their options. The Orange County DA is doing subpoenas and things like that and telling GKN, you are going to be handing over all of your documentation regarding this tank and operations and things like that. And he made some sort of comment about how if they are found they are destroying documentation, that's going to become an even bigger issue. GKN definitely is in some hot water. I personally don't think they're going to stay. The sort of reaction from residents now does make it seem like GKN's probably not welcome here anymore. So I will go over one thing, because one thing that is being brought up in questions quite a bit is, oh, how can there be such a large belt of industry in between the cities of Garden Grove and Stanton? And I mean, it's understandable because it is very out of place. As a matter of fact, like one of the centers in West Garden Grove over here by that facility is literally called like the Garden Grove Industrial Center. Like that's just the shopping center name. Like it's very well known that this is the industrial section of Garden Grove. In the 50s, the U.S. military had a Nike air missile defense system, and this particular plot of land of Chapman and Western was actually part of that site. I think it was LA-32. It housed Nike Ajax and later Nike Hercules missiles. The site was decommissioned in the 70s and sort of dismantled. They had a few options when it came to the land, and they chose to redevelop it as industrial land. As a matter of fact, if you go further down Western, there is a small radar station, which I believe was part of this missile system, that is still in operation today, and the military actually keeps equipment parked over there from time to time. So the question of why is there this swath of industry in between the two cities, that's the reason why. Prior to that, it was military, essentially, and after that, they turned it into industrial. GKN came to Garden Grove in about 1993, so they were not here before the residents were. And in that time, from 1993 till now, they have had a handful of violations and fines up to $1 million. I did want to address that because some people were asking about why there's a plant like that in residential area, and it's because it's mixed use in this particular part of West Garden Grove. It's very strange. You have a large amounts of residential with schools. There is a decent amount of commercial, and there's a fairly large amount of industrial areas, all sort of mixed together, the way the land is set up. So that is the reason why we have that here. But I just kind of wanted to recount my experience with what had occurred from Thursday until today, Wednesday. And like I said, for the very last time before I end the video, this was all personal experience and personal opinion. Information was either from personal experience or information I gathered through news outlets or researching. This is not 100% factual. These are all my experiences and opinions on what I have personally experienced and lived through. I do want to wrap the video up. I just kind of wanted to make something so at least people know what's going on. And I wanted to talk about, this, because this is not something, again, the city of Garden Grove admitted this is the first time they've ever had something like this happen. And unfortunately, it just, as soon as our situation wound down, a major situation in Washington popped up with that white liquor tank imploding and unfortunately taking the lives of several people. So, that would have been reported on regardless of what happened in Garden Grove or not, but it is there's quite a few industrial incidents that will be put into the spotlight because of what's happening. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and end the video. Thank you guys for watching. I hope this was informative if you had not heard about the situation, or hopefully I could have given some more insight as somebody who actually lived through it. Again, thank you guys for watching, and hopefully I will catch you in another video that is more positive than this. But until then, take it easy, guys. Stay safe, and I will hopefully catch you later. Thank you very much. Goodbye.